Hello and welcome to the third session of the webinar series, Rethink How We Build. My name is Sonia and I'm happy to moderate this exciting session today, jointly with my colleague, Julia. Julia, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone.
This is the final webinar of our series. We have invited international experts to discuss the topic Embodied Carbon from different angles over the course of 3 webinars. Last week, we discussed alternative building materials, recycling, and an international initiative for green steel and cement. Our topic for today is the right policy environment for a carbon neutral future. This webinar series is organized by the Implementing Office of the National Designated Entity Germany. The NDE Germany is one of 161 focal points that have been created in the framework of the technology mechanism of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Our aim is to facilitate the introduction, use, and transfer of climate-related technologies worldwide. The NDE Germany is hosted by the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, BMWi, on whose behalf the webinars are being organized. Before we start with our distinguished panelists today, let me give you a brief context for our webinar. The building sector is undergoing a significant transformation globally. Over half of the buildings that will stand in 2060 have not been built yet. Especially in Africa and Asia, the number of new buildings will increase rapidly in the coming years. This fast growth presents a challenge to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Hence, what we build today has severe consequences for our future emissions. This forces the buildings and construction sector to rethink materials and practices. And today we want to look at the right policy environment to do this. Additionally, we will take a sneak peek at the International Climate Conference, COP26, which will take place in Glasgow in the beginning of November. COP26 is considered significant as it will be the first COP to take place after the landmark Paris Agreement's measures take effect and the first opportunities since then for nations to come together to review commitments and strengthen ambition. Throughout the webinar, we want to encourage an open discussion. Our speakers will first provide some inputs, which is followed by a panel discussion. All listeners are muted, but you can type your question in the Q&A box, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions either for one presentation specifically, so we will pause after each presentation to allow for a few questions, or during the panel discussion. My colleague Julia will make sure that your questions will be integrated into the webinar. And of course, you may also tweet about today's event using our Twitter handle. This meeting will be recorded and uploaded to the homepage of the NDE. We will also upload the speakers' presentations there. As I said, this is a webinar series. So last week we looked at recycling and alternative materials. And I want to highlight again why we're looking at the building and construction sector. So as we know, roughly 100 billion tons of materials are consumed yearly, and 40% of it is for housing and infrastructure. And this also leads to a large amount of emissions. So last week we heard from a representative of the Industrial Decarbonization Initiative that governments are committing to green public procurement for steel and cement in order to reduce these emissions. We also heard from Research C3, who developed carbon reinforced concrete, which provides 80% material efficiency and 50% less emissions, so an alternative building material. We also heard from the private sector, from Holcim, for example, that they're spending 50% of their R&D budget to develop low carbon and circular solutions, and from Heidelberg Cement, who's paving the way on cement recycling as a carbon capture utilization technology. We also heard from Ecoplastil, a startup from Uganda, which is a digital social enterprise recycling plastics into sustainable building materials. In case you missed last week's discussion, have a look at our website and you can listen in. So I'm very much looking forward to continuing the discussion today with our speakers. In discussion are Senta Schmatzberger from the Buildings Performance Institute Europe, Rose Mambasa, the Director of the Climate Technology Center and Network, Christina Chiang from the Global Green Growth Institute, Will Hall from the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and Jan Kieso from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. Today, we want to jump right into the discussion. So let's start with our first panelist, Senta Schmatzberger, who works in the Berlin office of the Buildings Performance Institute Europe. As project manager at BPIE, Senta works on buildings, policies, and their environmental, social, and financial impacts. Over to you, Senta.
Thank you, Sonia. Thanks for the invitation today. I hope it will be an interesting discussion. Definitely, I have some questions already for the other speakers. Yes, let me jump right into the presentation. I work mainly on European buildings, a little bit also on German buildings. So just to give you an idea about the European building stock, if you don't know already, of the buildings that were built before 1975, 50% will still be in use in 2050, which means before 1975, we actually didn't have much building regulations in Europe. And therefore, all these buildings, when they are being renovated, they need to adhere to high standards, and a lot of them still have to undergo deep renovation. As we know, I think this goes for many other countries as well, not only for the European Union. Buildings account for 40% of total energy consumption and 36% of CO2 emissions in Europe. So that's quite a large share, actually. I'm shocked myself again and again when I see these numbers, because we feel like buildings actually don't have any CO2 emissions often, and they actually do have much more embodied carbon and also from CO2 emissions from the energy use. The current building regulations in Europe, this is just a little overview. You see three bubbles. The biggest bubbles are the existing standards, and existing standards here mean standards that are older and actually don't cover any whole life carbon emissions. New standards is smaller and is not as good either. Those are recently adopted standards that also don't cover a lot of embodied carbon, and new advanced standards or new standards that are like low energy standards, like for example, the near zero energy building standard, the NZEB standard, that's now like state of the art in Europe, but is also has now 27 different NZEB standards in Europe. So there's also not one that covers all countries. So you can see here, it gives us a clear picture of what we're facing standard-wise in Europe. Here you see the current state of the whole life carbon regulation in Europe. We've looked at this at BPIE according to the European standard. And this is, for example, production is covered, but you see, for example, it is covered in the levels framework, but levels is not a mandatory framework. So you see that a lot of these points are actually not covered at all in the EU policy instruments, and therefore there's still a lot to do. I mean, I don't want to go into the details of each of these steps, but yeah, I mean, we see, for example, the European Performance of Buildings Directive doesn't cover any of this, only operational energy use. And we at BPIE at least believe that this should be changed, and all these steps need to be covered somewhere in these regulations, and they need to be linked also. You can see here an overview of Europe. I mean, as you know, probably European countries, a lot of these regulations are implemented in their countries completely differently. Like I've also already mentioned the NZEB standard, and the NZEB standard can go from very good and very tight rules and very low energy to actually quite high energy use, and just like replacing heating with renewable energies and not looking at embodied carbon at all. So only these countries that you see here have even any whole life carbon regulation in place or planned. And I want to give you one short example of Denmark. You can see here that Denmark has rules to regulate whole life carbon from 2023 in the national buildings regulations. And oh, sorry, we are currently in the okay, I don't know if I've lost control of the screen or there we go. Yeah, sorry. You see here we're still in the preparation phase for Denmark, but you can see that the standards are going down. So the mandatory CO2 limits for new buildings will slowly decrease until 2029. And there's a mandatory limit, and then there's a voluntary limit for new buildings. So this is kind of the approach that taking it to say, like, countries like Denmark who are implementing whole life carbon regulations in Europe are those countries who have actually already reached pretty much the amount of operational energy that they can save. So they're now looking at, okay, where else in buildings can we actually save CO2, and how can we actually really decarbonize this building stock? And that's why they then look at the whole life carbon. It's mostly reasoning with, okay, where can we go even lower than we already are? So Denmark is anyway always a good practice model for buildings in Europe. And this is, of course, only for new buildings. So this is not looking at building renovation. We're also, of course, when energy efficiency requirements have to be met, there's a lot of building materials, as we heard last week, that actually also have embodied carbon and need to be also looked at. And here you see, for example, you see the operational carbon, which is quite low for different building types. And then you see the embodied carbon, which is still quite high in Denmark for the different building types. But this is still, as I said, a best practice model already in Europe. So other countries have much higher amounts here also for the operational carbon. And of course, other building stocks. So countries with more multifamily buildings, for example, which are in worse state, which were built before 1975 when there were no building regulations, of course, have more problems also than, for example, Denmark. Now, at BPIE, we've looked at the potential policy intervention points, and we've kind of divided them by material and product level, building level, and then corporate and market level, because I mean, buildings is such a complex system kind of, and there's so many different stakeholders involved, and construction companies, architects, the owners of the buildings. So we think that there are different stages where it has to be, where we have to apply different policy implementation. For example, I mean, on the material and product level, we believe there should be a material passport introduced, and that should be a European legislation. Product certification, there should be environmental product declarations. Of course, data availability has to largely be increased, and that's one of the, for Europe at least, that's one of the major problems for buildings in general, and also whole life carbon, is that in many countries we don't actually know what buildings there are and how much embodied carbon they have, because we don't have the data from the EPCs, from the energy performance certificates, to show what state the buildings are in. So this is a huge issue that we need to address. Data availability and what kind of products have actually been built into these existing houses, and which products are being built into a house. So I mean, every new building should actually have already a material passport when it's finished, that is given also to the owners, and everybody should know how much embodied carbon the building has and what kind of environmental footprint this building already comes with from start, without any operational carbon that we're looking at. And of course, enforceability and validation of in-use product performance has to be improved across Europe. And I mean, we are fans of having European standards that countries can implement in their own way, but of course that a certain standard has to apply for all countries, and it has to be introduced step by step so that everybody knows what's ahead of them, at least let's say until 2030. Then on the building level, we need to set carbon metrics and targets in addition to the existing energy indicators in the energy performance certificates. We have to look at net zero carbon buildings and not only zero energy buildings. And as already said, we need to gradually require LCA and life cycle costing. And public buildings should always be, I mean, this is also something I would say for other countries. Public buildings should be role model buildings and should show what can be done and how it should be done. And then, of course, the use of building information modeling and building logbooks is upcoming also already in Europe and can help to incorporate also these material passports and incorporate knowledge about the building and be like a go-to source of what is in this building, which materials have been used, how much embodied carbon, what can be done, what state is this building in. And of course, on the corporate and market level, I mean, we heard a lot about that last week also, what is already being done. But I still think that there needs to be some kind of reporting and disclosure requirements for companies. And then, of course, financing needs to be somehow aligned with whole life carbon targets so that we don't finance thousands, millions of buildings or building renovations that don't include whole life carbon goals, standards. Sorry, I think there, yeah. Here you see the policy timeline and anchors for the European level. And of course, after the European level decides or revises certain legislation, then the national level comes and implements these revisions. The Innovation Wave strategy was published last year, also with a strong focus on whole life carbon integration, but it's a strategy and it's not binding for anybody. So we have the Fit for 55 climate package now, which had as part of it the EED revision and the ETS revision, which you see here for 2021 already. And we have the Horizon Europe working program, which funds different research projects and is also going to fund a lot of whole life carbon research and research into building logbooks and renovation passports and material passports. And so all of this is going to is actually in a flow at the moment. And the EPBD revision of the Energy Performance Buildings Directive is upcoming in the fourth quarter of 2021. And I think it will be interesting to see if the Commission actually includes a lot of whole life carbon measures or not. I'm not sure myself. We've kind of put here some policy options. What to do until a vision of 2050, or nowadays we talk more maybe also about 2045 to reach carbon neutrality. Currently, actually, there should be a lot of preparation going on, preparing the ground for the introduction of whole life carbon metrics and adopting an EU-wide methodology. I think, as I already said, with the NZEB methodology, we've seen that it doesn't really work to leave that to each member state. There should be an EU-wide standard, and we can build on standards we already have for different construction products and on the energy performance certificate. So these should kind of be expanded. We need to introduce requirements for new buildings to report on the embodied carbon that they have. I already mentioned that. And there should be a clear timeline because as we know in buildings, I mean, I think we cannot say that often enough. Any building that's being renovated now in 2021 is not going to be renovated again before 2030 or 2040 even. So what we do now should be as ambitious as possible to make sure that these buildings do not have to be renovated again, especially in the site of embodied carbon, and that we use sustainable materials. I know it for Austria and Germany, for example. Now everybody wants to build with wood, but also wood is not indefinitely available. There's already a shortage now of sustainable products. So we need to look at what's going on. Construction companies, but also building owners need to know where their building is going, or if they're planning a new building, how are they going to build it, and which materials are available, which are sustainable, how much embodied carbon do they have, and what options also do they have. I mean, it doesn't always have to be only one option. So in Europe also then by 2030, there will be upgraded definitions for nearly zero energy building NZEBs, and those will have to include net zero carbon definitions. And there needs to be an agreement on setting carbon limits for buildings by 2030, the latest, I would say. I mean, the earlier the better, as I already said, to avoid also stranded assets for companies. I mean, it's a huge financial problem also for many when the standards tighten. And then for 2040, I mean, obviously it has to be continually reviewed and monitored, and targets have to be adapted, and we have to see how it works. And obviously there will be new technology and new materials, and probably also new calculation methods, and we will see in light also of the whole climate change debate and the roadmap there, where we are standing. And so our 2050 vision is, of course, to have a net zero building stock by 2050 for the European Union and across the entire life cycle, to make sure that the buildings that need to be also torn down can be recycled and reused and changed and adapted accordingly. I think that's also something to remember, which is important. And I've just collected quickly some recommendations for the Energy Performance Directive, but I won't go through all of them. I think the presentation will also be made available. It's just to show again what we think needs to be implemented now in the Energy Performance Directive to make sure that we're on the right track, because these are the European Union processes are very long, and the recast of the EPBD will take 2 or 3 years. So we need to see where do we want to be in 2 or 3 years. And I think the points I've mentioned, and tightening standards and showing a roadmap of how to get to a zero carbon building stock is important to provide it now to the people dealing with this. And just to end, I think we have to look at the low-hanging fruits first to get some CO2 emissions out of the way, so to speak. Looking at the cost-effective measures is often the operational energy use, which already has largely been reduced. We need to adopt life cycle approaches and give a lot of financial resources into this to begin with, to also start some best practice examples more, and quick start, like startups in the construction industry, to help them change their production ways. And we should start with carbon reporting requirements, build benchmarks, and set target values. And maybe start with voluntary measures, but show how these voluntary measures can be done, and not only say, okay, do something, you know, as you wish, because that might not lead to a good standard. And we should consistently increase the weight of the non-price criteria in public procurement. So environmental and quality criteria. I mean, I think public procurement and public buildings can lead the way, and also quick start kind of the market for sustainable building products in a way that like private businesses often can't, because it's a huge market for them. Yeah, thank you. That was it. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Senta, for providing us with this great overview of building regulation and the European perspective. Julia, do we have one direct question from the audience to Senta?
We actually have a few questions. So the very first one is about one of your slides. The question is, what does EGV stand for in EGV per square meter per year?
Oh, sorry, now I... I'm not sure. I'll have to check that. Wait a minute.
Okay. Then the other question would be, will embodied carbon be part of the EU Fit for 55 package?
I mean, the Fit for 55 package was published last week, and I haven't had the chance to go through it in detail, but it's definitely in there. And we're hoping that it will be part also of the EPBD. So the EPBD revision hasn't been published yet, the suggestions from the European Commission. So, but definitely, yes, it will be part of the Fit for 55 package, and will definitely play a role also in the EPBD revision. We just don't know to what extent yet.
Yeah, but that's good news then, if you're certain that it's going to be part of that for Europe.
It's always, I guess, for Europe, it's often also the question like how the formulation is in the European Commission document. You know, often it's like optional, or it's just a recommendation to add something. And so then the countries don't actually implement it because it's optional. So a lot of it is national implementation. And that's why I think these national examples like Denmark are very important to share also among European countries.
And talking about sharing learnings from Europe to other countries, what do you think, which learnings could be transferred to other countries outside of Europe?
I mean, I think maybe not to make, I mean, it's not a mistake, but to see that Europe is now moving on from energy performance to carbon performance, and that much more of the life cycle has to be included than only the energy performance. So that if a country doesn't actually have any standards yet, that the standards are much higher than just following what Europe already has. And I mean, also looking at sustainable construction products and looking at the national situations. I mean, it's also, I mean, in buildings, obviously, it's a lot about geography and climate, and cooling is super important in a lot of countries, and it's becoming much more important also in Europe. And that also causes a lot of carbon emissions. So building a building that doesn't need a lot of cooling and doesn't need a lot of heating is probably the best when you're using sustainable materials. But yeah, looking at European standards also helps, I think.
We do have two more questions, but I think they might also be interesting to ask our other panelists. So I would post them for the moment and come back to them at a later stage.
Sounds good. Thanks, Julia. Then you can already see the next slide, which is introducing our next speaker. And I'm very delighted that she's on the panel today. Rose Mambasa, she's the director of the Climate Technology Center and Network. She brings with her over 20 years of experience on a wide range of climate change, environment, and sustainable issues. Rose, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm really very pleased to be part of this conversation today. I would just like to start by saying that the UN Climate Technology Center and Network, as you would know, is part of the operational arm of the technology mechanism. And indeed, our mandate is to support the transfer of environmentally sound technologies from developed to developing countries. So it was very interesting listening to the previous speaker in terms of what Europe is doing and the lessons that can be derived from that. We are supported by a network of over 161 NDEs in as many countries, and it's part of the reason why we are here. And we are grateful for the opportunity by the NDE Germany, because part of our mandate also is to learn and share experiences and lessons, especially from developing countries, especially for the benefit of developing countries. So we are operational in over 100 countries. And to date, we've supported the transfer of over 300 technology solutions, the majority of which are from developed countries to developing countries. So we are a good demonstration of what a multilateral system looks like when it functions very well and when countries come together, both developed and developing, to work on climate solutions. So I will start by sharing with you a little bit on the magnitude of the problem and why we work on buildings at the CTCN. This is information that many of you would know if you look at the pie charts on the screen, but what they are really telling us is that carbon emissions from the building sector are at their highest ever, and that the building sector alone accounts for almost 38% of global carbon emissions, 10% of which are embodied carbon emissions in buildings and in the construction value chain. And we also know now that the building materials represent 50% of the demand for cement and 30% of the demand for steel, which also have very carbon intensive production systems. Embodied carbon emissions in upstream are irreversible if not managed at the construction stage, and therefore the importance of the energy efficient operations of buildings and the share of embodied carbon emissions will increase if not addressed at source. We also know that building construction and demolition waste leads to material losses. It worsens carbon intensity in the value chain. So that is another important element that we look at. So as I said, relative to other sectors, the building sector is really deleterious in terms of its contribution to carbon emissions if you look at industry or transport or the other sectors. For the work we do at the UN Climate Technology Center, we are generally guided by the policies of the member states at national level, especially their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, as we call them. When we did a last survey of the NDCs, we are currently analyzing the new NDCs. We found that indeed NDCs prioritize actions relating to decarbonizing the building stock. When we did our analysis, 136 countries did in fact mention buildings as important for climate action. 53 countries specifically mentioned building energy efficiency, and 38 specifically call out the importance of building energy codes. We found that of these 136 countries, 73 had building energy codes and had a very clear value chain approach. But we also found that there was a clear lack of value chain approach on the building industry. And I think the former speaker made an important point when she said we need to move really from just energy efficiency to carbon performance of buildings. In terms of investment, we also know that investment on energy efficient buildings has increased to $150 billion US. Those are 2019 figures, but it still remains outpaced by investments in conventional buildings. So for every dollar that is invested in an energy efficient building, in fact, $37 is invested in a conventional building. So it's still a real problem in terms of our path to net zero. So building certification and sustainable procurement of building materials are one of the key areas we are working on in terms of supporting especially developing countries. So given that context, I'll share with you some of the work we are doing to support developing countries. Our mandate in the UNFCCC is to support developing countries. So all the examples I will give are based on the work we are doing in these countries. The first example is from Thailand. We supported the government of Thailand to access Green Climate Fund readiness funding to enable them to achieve national safety targets for energy efficiency in the building sector as defined in their National Energy Efficiency Plan of 2015. They also had this in their NAMAs and in their NDCs. And basically what they wanted us to deliver for them is a detailed technology assessment in line with their current building energy code for standards and future goals. They wanted us to provide a technology performance evaluation across key building typologies most suited for Thailand. They have 5 building typologies in Thailand that they've identified as suitable for their landscape and climate. And then they also wanted us to identify the threshold level of energy efficiency to create an investment baseline. So while they were allowing the fact that investors in the building sector may not be able to reach the highest standards of efficiency for buildings, they wanted to set a baseline, below which no investment in the building sector would be allowed. And then lastly, they wanted us to work with their senior government officials and other technical people to build capacity on green building design and evaluation, construction, technology implementation, and retrofits and operation and maintenance of buildings in low carbon and resilient manner. So in Thailand, basically what we found in supporting the government is that many buildings in fact, did not comply with the individual performance requirements of the building envelope, especially relating to lighting, air conditioning, and hot water generation systems. We also found that there was a high degree of non-compliance, or, especially for walls and windows and roofs relating to thermal transfer. And so generally there was no compliance, even if the government had regulations that were as old as 2009. So we did make several recommendations on how building materials and building design technologies can comply better with Thailand's building codes. And we do have a full report of the support we've provided on our website. The second example I'll give you of the support we've given to support green buildings is in Sri Lanka. So in Sri Lanka, we received a request from the government to support them to establish a pathway for transitioning of the Kurunegala city through the capacity enhancement of city planners and policymakers into a low emission municipality. It was largely a capacity building request. And when we went into Thailand, we found some interesting things there. In Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, green buildings comprise mostly of roof and wall designs that are enabled for efficient use of energy and eco-friendly construction materials. That is the priority that is given by government. And so in order for them to transition to a climate smart city, what we did is work with the government to develop a roadmap with the proposed action plans on green buildings. Here, we looked at city level expansion of policies with targets on greening public and private buildings. We worked with them on mandatory regulations for green building ratings and certifications. We also worked with the government of Sri Lanka on identification of energy intensive buildings through baselining, auditing and reporting of energy intensive buildings with a review to retrofit or redesign some of these buildings. And then of course, we also worked on capacity building of municipal authorities and policymakers in order to ensure that they are able to implement the government policies, but also to follow up on them. The other example I will give before I close is in relation to the request we received from the government of Antigua and Barbuda. The government of Antigua and Barbuda approached us for support to build climate resilient buildings that are able to withstand Category 5 hurricanes, extreme flooding, and extended drought. And so what we did in responding to this request is we worked with the government of Antigua and Barbuda to conduct a technical assessment of all key government buildings, including hospitals, police offices, fire stations, and schools, as well as their key service inputs, which include food, water, and electricity. We also identified with the government of Antigua and Barbuda detailed interventions required to make the buildings resilient to the impacts of climate change and variability. Specifically, as I said, they were worried about hurricanes, they were worried about extreme flooding and extended drought. And then we provided a comprehensive costing of the adaptation interventions for the government. And then we made also recommendations for policies and standards relating to building codes and other recommendations for them to achieve the best climate resilient goals. And again, all this support we provided is to make this country more climate resilient. It's one of the small island states that really suffers from extreme weather events. The last example I will give is in Kyrgyzstan, the Republic of Kyrgyzstan. They approached us for support, basically in enhancing the building energy codes to institutionalize and standardize the energy performance of buildings. They were basically looking at public buildings. And so what we did at their request was to benchmark international practices on building energy performance with countries that had similar landscapes as Kyrgyzstan. We also undertook a gap analysis for them on selected building codes that the government identified. And then we created for them a database of relevant clean energy technologies and building materials for public and residential buildings. This is a repository of knowledge and technologies that they really wanted to help them plan. And then we developed energy codes with them, and then an approach on how they can implement the building energy codes. So as I said, we are the operational arm of the UNFCCC. Our support to member states is very practical. It's policy work, it's access to technology. And so what we see in the work we do is that definitely technology development and innovation have the potential to play an important role towards low embodied carbon buildings. But the technological transfer must be accompanied by appropriate policies and regulatory standards, including codes. So designing innovative circular materials and products that can be recovered in closed loop processes can reduce the demand for construction materials. And this is something we are working with countries increasingly to make sure they integrate in their planning. We also make sure we communicate to the countries that smart selections of materials for components and structures with minimized life cycle impact using material libraries is also important. The as is right sizing and lightweight of components and structures. We've talked about wood, there are all those options, but the idea is to promote environmentally sound technologies and materials. So wood, unless it's sustainable, is something we ask countries to consider. We also ask them to consider use of thermal properties for construction, as well as use of structures with extended lifespans. So there are several recommendations we make. I'll just focus on one, which is the adoption of off-site modular constructions for disassembling and enhancing additive manufacturing. Especially for developed countries, this is not only technologically efficient, it's also cost effective. So, and then maybe lastly, just to say, we are also encouraging the use of remote sensing and geophysics for characterization of materials to enable recovery and reuse in the existing value chain, because many of these countries will not be able to build new buildings. They should be able to retrofit the current buildings, or at least to recycle or recover some of the material they are using. So I will stop here for now, and I'll be happy to take a few questions on some of the work we are doing in the countries we support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rose, for highlighting the important work that CTCN is doing in all the developing countries and for providing us with these many successful examples. Julia, I'm sure there are several questions to Rose. Maybe you can pick one or two again.
Yes, we have a very active audience today, which is great. So the first question to Rose is, from an emission point of view, do you think the high-rise steel structure is better than concrete?
I will provide a preamble to my response by saying that as a UN entity, we do not provide preferential options for member states, because we cannot be seen to be biased, because ultimately the technology service providers are private sector companies that invest in this. What we do really, whether it's steel or concrete buildings, is to work with the countries before they make the decisions to identify the most suitable and most appropriate technological solution. It's based on the landscape, on the country. So it would be completely different, let's say, from what we did in Barbuda and Antigua to what we did in Kyrgyzstan. So it's not really a question of either or, it's not a straight cut preference, but it's also a question of geographies and location, but also capability in terms of costs and ability over the long term to maintain the technologies that are transferred.
Thank you for that. And maybe a second question. What are the barriers for developing countries adopting standards on embodied carbon in buildings? And how is the CTCN, or how can you support them in overcoming these barriers?
Definitely one of the key barriers that countries are facing, they are linked, I would say, to a lot of the construction that was done up until now really was not done with climate resilience in mind, even for countries that face extreme weather events on a more regular basis, like small island states in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. So the biggest barrier then is how to get the right technologies to retrofit those buildings or to construct a whole new set of structures. We know that in some countries where they are building whole new cities that are more climate resilient with new building codes, but that is not always possible. So the barrier really is the access to the resources, financing, but to the technologies. It's part of the reason why we are here. Countries are not sure what technologies are available for the building industry. And so that is why in one of the examples I gave, we give an inventory of what is happening. It's actually largely countries in Europe, Denmark and the others, and how they can borrow these technologies and contextualize them, because it's not a one a one size fits all, but they can learn from these technologies. The other barrier is, as you've noticed, all our support comes with capacity building. It's really capacity and skilling, for these new technologies and the new construction materials and buildings. And so we have to build that if we are going to support these countries to build climate resilient buildings.
Thank you, Rose. Julia, I'm sure the other questions we can ask them in the panel discussion. So then let me introduce our next speaker, Christina Chiang. She's a Green City specialist at the Global Green Growth Institute with the Division of Investment and Policy Solution. And she's currently based in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you so much for joining, Christine. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sonia. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with all of you. So today I'm going to share some preliminary results from a study that the Global Green Growth Institute has been conducting this year. So GGGi is an international organization, and we have country presence in over 30 countries, mostly developing countries, where we work with the governments to develop sustainable development plans and projects to mobilize financing that can support them in development in more sustainable trajectories. So, so rather than share about our project results, today I'm going to share mostly about a study that we have been doing this year. We have been talking with stakeholders in a few of our member countries about their transition towards green buildings. So this study quite deliberately takes an open approach to green buildings. So we did not define what green building should be, and these were sort of teased out during our discussions with local stakeholders. And in these studies, we tried to engage more with key industrial champions or government officials who were responsible for such transitions, or and in some countries we spoke with academics who were very vocal about promoting such a transition in their countries. So you'll see on the screen the 7 countries that were covered in this year's study, and this is a very broad summary of the state of green building certification in the countries. You will see that in most countries, except for the UAE, in the final row of the table, that most of them have 0 or 1 certified green building, with the exception of Philippines, where there are significantly more. Of course, the UAE has over 1,000 certified buildings, and in most of these countries, there are no mandatory or voluntary green building standards that are actively being implemented. In Rwanda, the government adopted minimum compliance guidelines for green buildings in 2019. That was also a project that GGGi developed with them, and this has been incorporated into the building code of Rwanda. However, with some delays due to COVID and due to capacity development needs, this minimum compliance guidelines is also not yet being fully implemented. In the UAE, on the other hand, of course, the country consists of numerous emirates, and some emirates are way more developed than others in terms of adoption of green building standards and certification schemes. Abu Dhabi, for example, has their own certification scheme. Dubai as well has their own certification scheme. And the other emirates, for example, Ashman, is also experimenting with voluntary standards that are increasingly going to become mandatory. In Philippines, of course, they have numerous industry developed standards for the country that are being implemented and adopted by industrial players, but these are by no means mandatory. So, I suppose that the main picture I wanted to paint with this slide is that most of the countries that we work with and also that are covered in this study, they are still at the very beginning stage of conceptualizing how they would move their building industry from what it is currently to a net zero carbon industry in the next 30 years. And this is a big transition, and the aspiration is there. Of course, in many of these countries, they have reflected the ambition to improve the sustainability of the building sector in their NDCs, in their national strategies, in their national plans. So what we wanted to do with this study was really to assess whether there are pathways for facilitating such a transition in the time span that the governments have in mind. So you see here the standard curve of introduction of new technologies or new innovations, and we have in our study picked out that very often actually in all of the countries that we have interviewed, the early adopters tended to be industry professionals. There would always be some architects, some developers, some engineers, some manufacturers who are first to introduce the idea of low carbon building and energy efficient building and net zero building, and such a concept through their designs, through their projects. They want to demonstrate how things could be done better. On the role of governments, it's a little bit mixed. So I have stretched out the box from an early majority towards the laggards. Governments play, of course, they play an essential role, and that's what the past two presenters have been talking about, the importance of policy and a supportive regulatory environment. But governments have tended not to be early adopters. In the countries that we have featured in our study, governments have been, some have been quick to follow these industry leaders, and some are, I would say, waiting for industry to lead the way. So yeah, of course, governments have different access to resources, and they cope with different environments and different situations. So governments' interests and governments' motivations are quite varied in the countries that we have studied. The smaller local businesses, smaller medium enterprises, they have tended to be a little bit later also in their adoption of, in fact, they are generally quite resistant to any change in design, change in technology or methods for the building and construction industry, tending to prefer to stick to business as usual. And I think in many cases, this is due to the lack of resources to make the transition. And so they do need either development partner support or government support to overcome this capacity gap and also this capital gap to make the transition. As for universities and training institutes, in most countries as well, industry and governments have found that they are slow to provide the required syllabus or the required training to train up the new professionals in order to support a rapid transition towards greener buildings. So I see that through our study, I think one of the key areas of support is to work with industry professionals to create this momentum so that the rest can also ride the wave. So following from that, our study also has shown that in the different countries with their different constraints, but also different opportunities really, there are different pathways towards green buildings. And we're not talking about one single project, but leading towards a mainstreaming of green buildings in the different countries. Very often these, well, not very often, sometimes this transition is government-led. And when it is government-led, it's top-down. It comes with a policy. It comes with a green building rating system. It comes with compliance requirements, but it often also comes with incentives and penalties. Yeah, so there will be resources provided by government to build capacity, to reward those who comply, reward those who excel. And so these resources then can promote the adoption of new technologies and new design methods. When it is industry-led, this has tended to be a bit slower and a bit more constrained in terms of resources for the transition. So it doesn't reach the smaller and medium enterprises. It often comes with the bigger projects, bigger and more well-resourced developments. And these then can slowly create a momentum, an economy of scale, so that prices for green buildings or greener technologies can gradually become more affordable for other developments and other retailers. Yeah, and in community-led initiatives, we have encountered in a few of our country interviews, and namely in Fiji, they talk a lot more about the need for incorporating local materials, for indigenous building designs, for considering resilient buildings. But for them, climate resilience takes on a different meaning from what external organizations understand, right? So one of the examples that they shared was that there is this community that has got well-built indigenous housing, and then of course Fiji, being a Pacific island country, is highly susceptible to cyclones, and there are some buildings that have been set up in their community that were contributed by donor funding, and these were demonstration buildings of how modern materials could give rise to more robust and more resilient buildings in times of cyclone. However, when a cyclone actually did hit, these buildings, these modern buildings, which were not properly maintained over time, were the ones that had the roof being blown off, and these metallic roofs in turn damaged the indigenous buildings which were not otherwise damaged. So this also then frames the idea of resilience in a very different setting, in a different understanding, and we do need to consider community-led or indigenous strategies for incorporating embodied carbon, low embodied carbon materials, as well as resilience in the way that is acceptable to local communities. And of course, there is another pathway, which is the investor-led or donor-led initiatives. And we see that a lot in the UAE and in Mongolia as well, where donor-led projects to introduce the idea of green buildings in the absence of government leadership or government projects or industry-led projects. However, also in these contexts where it's more driven by external partners, we see that the impact and the adoption rate is very localized, and the beneficiaries or those that gain capacity or benefit from an improved performance buildings, these are very enclosed communities. So in the case of UAE, it tended to be the higher income group. In the case of Mongolia, it tended to be the groups that were involved in the development projects, and it didn't cascade through to the wider community that easily. So different pathways have different levels of impact. Of course, also requires different levels of resources. In my last slide, I just wanted to just reiterate that different countries have access to different resources and also face different constraints. And so the countries that we have spoken to have adopted different strategies towards mainstreaming of green buildings. Yeah, some countries have chosen to start on a low standard, but they can achieve broad compliance, and then they gradually increase the requirements, having achieved this broad compliance, hoping to gradually increase the standards of buildings broadly. Yeah, some countries have chosen to adopt a high standard to start with comprehensive building code, and these have faced a bit of challenges with implementation, with capacity building and getting the supply chain ready. So so different strategies with different results. Some have chosen to adopt modern materials and modern technologies in order to achieve better building energy performance. And some have chosen to focus more on indigenous building materials and construction methods. And these also with different considerations and different risks that they face. There are some governments that have chosen to provide or even development partners that have chosen to provide support for the low-income communities so that they can access the resources to also be able to develop a green building or green compliant building housing. Yeah, and some governments have decided to then, instead of providing financial support or technology support, capacity support, they have chosen then to lower the standards so that lower income housing can meet the lower standards for green buildings, and that's a completely different strategy. So I want to stop here and welcome any questions from you, and happy to discuss this further.
Thank you very much, Christina, for highlighting the role of the different stakeholders for a transition to zero carbon or green buildings, and also for enlightening us again about the importance of resilience as well as indigenous approaches for embodied carbon. Julia, do we have a question to Christina?
Yes, we have one question. So given that enforcement and new technology is needed, do you think the United Nations should provide guidelines like the SDGs, for example, also for green buildings?
I think that overall, with all the stakeholders that we have spoken with, there is a very strong desire to meet the SDGs, to raise their ambitions in the NDCs and to meet them. There is a very genuine intent to contribute to climate change mitigation, while at the same time, they face constraints, of course, of local resources, and also there are other challenges like climatic challenges. I'm not sure more guidelines would be useful, but if there are guidelines that can be not sympathetic, but guidelines that are sensitive to local opportunities or local conditions and circumstances, I think that would be very helpful. So maybe to repeat what the previous Rose has mentioned, that these approaches need to really be cognizant that one size really does not fit all. Yeah, and we approach it with a local lenses.
Thank you, Christina. From all the speakers today, we've heard a lot about the important role of governments when it comes to the building sector. So be it a leading role for public buildings or for public procurement. And of course, if we talk about governments, we need to have a look at the International Climate Conference, COP26 in Glasgow. So I'm very happy that Will Hall is here today. He's the head of buildings and industry for COP26 at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And he will hopefully give us a bit of a sneak peek. Thank you, Will.
Great, thank you, Sonia. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak today about what we're going to be doing at COP26 in the area of built environment, and more specifically on embodied carbon as well. So I'm just going to speak for a few minutes about the plans that we've got in terms of logistics, but also the kind of policy coordination we're trying to achieve at Glasgow. So I think we're not far out from Glasgow now. We're about 104 days until COP26, which is quite scary from where I'm sitting. But we're starting to finalise the 2-week programme of what's going to be represented and how across those 2 weeks. And I think that the COP president Alok Sharma really wanted to recognise the importance of the built environment, and in that way we have a dedicated cities, regions and built environment day, a theme day at COP26, where we're trying to bring together built environment stakeholders, but particularly to bring together those stakeholders and examples of where they're delivering successfully through subnational and local leaders. And we know that 70% of a city's emissions are from the built environment. So for us, it makes a lot of sense to try and tell that story, the positive message of where we're going on the built environment, through local leaders, whether those be mayors or other kind of subnational leaders or community leaders. And just to say as well, on the day, we're very much trying to focus not only on mitigation, but more broadly on the kind of the 4 COP goals, which the COP president set out earlier this year. And these are the goals of mitigation, yes, but also adaptation. I know a lot of what Rose and Christina has spoken about, touched a lot on kind of implementing resilient buildings. Also finance, the role of finance in deploying green technologies, particularly in developing world. And then the 4th and final goal being collaboration. So really, how do we come together in the international sphere on these kind of sectoral areas of transition to kind of really make sure that we are accelerating the transition to make it faster, easier, and cheaper for all. So from a policy perspective, I just wanted to touch on a few things and what we've kind of seen come forward from stakeholders in our engagement in this day and in the run up to COP. I think that the first thing is that obviously we want to try and embed a full supply chain approach to built environment emissions at COP26 here. I think a lot of what we've heard or what we've seen, I should say, in the years previously is very much a strong focus on operational emissions in buildings. So I think a lot of the international work that the likes of the World Bank and others have been doing, and the IEA, is very much focused on implementing, for example, the most energy efficient air conditioning units. These kind of technology programs, which are focused on mitigating or reducing the operational emissions from buildings, typically heating and cooling. I think we are still obviously trying to give a stage to that, and I think the UK this year has been championing the Super Emission Appliance Deployment Initiative under the Clean Energy Ministerial with support from the IEA. But beyond this, we really kind of want to now move into the embodied carbon space in a bit more detail, where there has been, I think, a lack of emphasis. So very glad to be joining this webinar series. I think in terms of the embodied carbon approach that we're taking, I think I'll probably touch on a few kind of initiatives which will have a platform at COP26, and where we're collaborating with partners like Jan Olakiso from Germany on this call, and others around how to rapidly reduce emissions from embodied carbon in buildings. So I think just to say more broadly in our kind of collaboration policy approach internationally, we're very much trying to align 2 sets of broad policy. What on the one hand is a kind of a market creation set of policies. So think of things like creating standards and building regulations, like we've heard from speakers today. Also potentially procurement initiatives where both public and private sector can say, we're going to buy this amount, or we're going to only buy low carbon materials. So I think that's one half of the puzzle, market creation. And then the other half of the puzzle, which I think is a lot more what Rose was talking about in the context of their work, is more on the kind of supply push. So making sure that technologies are available and they're low cost. So this can be technology deployment and transfer initiatives, and it can also be earlier stage R&D collaboration to try and bring down those costs. So in the kind of realm of embodied carbon, and particularly the industries we talk to are the kind of the heavy industries, and in the steel and cement sector, we're very much trying to kind of embed these parallel processes. So on the demand pull side, or the market creation side, what we're doing here is really trying to create lead markets for low carbon materials like green steel and green cement. And I know last week in the previous webinar series, you heard from the Clean Energy Ministerial's Industrial Deep Decarbonisation Initiative. And we're very proud to say from the UK, we launched that in partnership with India in June this year. I'm very happy to have Germany, Canada, and the UAE also in support of that initiative. And this is really about creating those lead markets through standards and procurement policies. And that's kind of more on the public sector side, but also to say on the private sector side, we're working very closely with the likes of the Climate Group and their Steel Zero initiative, which does the same for kind of building contractors. So for example, some of the largest building contractors in Europe have signed up to Steel Zero to say, by 2030, we commit to reducing our emissions in our use of steel by, I think it's 30%, and then on a pathway to net zero by 2050. We're also working quite closely with Responsible Steel, the Green Steel Standards body, which is kind of being supported by ArcelorMittal. So that kind of collection of policies we're trying to bring together to really try and stimulate and create those lead markets for green products, which is a very important piece of the puzzle. On the other side, so that this kind of the supply push part of the problem, this is really about bringing countries together to both transfer technologies which already exist. So kind of in the steel sector, going back to that as an example, this is very much about identifying who the leaders are today. So you can think Sweden, Germany, Austria are doing really great work in terms of deploying low carbon steel-based technologies. But the fact of the matter is that the bulk of emissions from steel and the bulk of demand from steel will come from places like South Asia, particularly India, and also countries throughout Africa and countries throughout Latin America. So how do we make sure that those technologies are being delivered and provided and supplied to those countries, in the mid to late 2020s and not in the kind of the 2030s, to try and make sure that the mitigations are avoided before they are put in place? And I think a couple of the organizations that we're working through, obviously the CTCN and kind of Rose's work is an excellent example of that technology transfer. We're also increasingly working through Mission Innovation, which is a kind of multilateral innovation forum, which works on a number of different sectors. And we're hoping to launch a new industry mission alongside the government of Austria at COP26 itself, focusing on potentially a number of industry sectors. So that's kind of a quick run through for me in terms of how we're looking at built environment at COP26. It will have quite a big presence there, which we're all very happy about, given it's 40% of emissions. And then also a bit more detail on the kind of policy work that we're doing to sit underneath that, to make sure we've got those two parts of the puzzle as we see it, on a supply push and a demand pull side, to really accelerate the adoption of green materials for the construction sector. So that was a very quick run through by me, but I'll stop there and very happy to take any questions. But thank you for the invite, Sonia.
Thank you very much, Will. I would suggest we move straight to the panel discussion, and then all questions can be asked and answered. I also want to introduce another speaker to you who will join the panel discussion. This is Jan Ole Kiso. He works as a policy advisor at the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy in the Department of Emission Trading, Climate Change and International Environmental Policy. So all these speakers together can answer your questions. Let me start with a question directly to Will, but then all other speakers, if you could kindly switch on your videos, you're also very free to answer. Will, you've mentioned a lot about international commitments that are being made on the way to Glasgow. I'm wondering a little bit, if we look specifically at COP26 in Glasgow now, do you expect any specific commitments that will be made for the building sector? Is that something you think is realistic? Or if I rephrase it a little bit, what would be your hopes with regard to the policy sector at COP? Or for the other panelists also, what would be your hopes for COP26?
Yeah, thanks, Sonia. It's a really pertinent question. I think that the built environment sector has for a while now been slightly out of focus. We've made incredible progress in the power sector, and we've got a lot of international collaboration and targets in that area. I think increasingly the transport sector, we've got a lot of targets and a lot of kind of new collaboration. In particular, I'm thinking of the new Zero Emissions Vehicle Transition Council, which the UK government launched this year. But I think for the built environment sector, we're yet to reach that level of kind of collaboration and target setting. And I think partly it's because the built environment sector is so broad and people kind of don't know where to stop and start with the built environment sector. So it has been tricky. But I think this year, if I was kind of, to be honest, in terms of, what would be great, I think we're working very closely with the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, who is a really good kind of coordinating body in this space. And they've got 35 country members. And we're trying to work together with them to see, what's the ambition of your members to launch something new from country members as well as private sector members, where we can really set out, I think, 2050 targets are great, but I think really for COP26, what we're trying to achieve is kind of, what are we doing in the next 10 years and making that a lot clearer than it has been to date. So I think I'm hopeful for something worked up with the GABC. And of course, just as well, quickly plug that there's some really great work being done by the Climate Champions team who work for the UN, and they're coordinating a lot of the private sector activity through their Race to Zero campaign. So if you haven't seen that, do check that out. I think they're looking to sign up 20% of the built environment sector by market share for net zero, which would again be a really great win for us.
Great, thanks, Wei. Christina, I see that you've raised your hand.
Thanks, Sonia. So yes, I agree with that, and I think that because the building and construction sector is very diverse, and actually the difficulty in having impact other than introducing rules and building codes, which we have found through the Rwanda experience, that if you pitch your standards too high at the first try, it's very difficult for implementation. And so you have the building codes, but then nothing really changes on the ground. And it's really important that we engage with the small and medium-sized companies, because this is where most of the construction activity really happens. So I would like to see a lot more concerted effort to engage with the SMEs, to provide capacity to build technical skills and to support them in this transition in different countries. Thanks.
Thank you, Christina. Jan.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I just quickly wanted to say that I have the feeling that there's a slightly different emphasis now on the international negotiations, kind of shifting from the production side to the demand side. That we're now looking much more at materials which are kind of globally traded and what their embedded emissions are than previously. So I believe that the kind of the topics which we discuss here will be very pertinent for the international work, and it's great that the UK government is focusing on this as well. Thank you.
Okay, and if our other speakers want to add something about their hopes for COP26? If not, then I'm sure there are many questions from the audience. Julia?
Yes, so we have one from the very beginning, which was initially posted to Senta, but I thought that maybe also other panelists might want to come into that. So the question is, what is actually the technology and methods to reuse building materials, which is more than 40 years old?
Is this a I mean, I guess building materials could always be reused. I don't know what this person is referring to exactly.
Well, I'm guessing since you showed that many of the buildings from 1975 will still be standing in the 50s. So then when you think about reusing these materials in the future, do we already have the technology to do that? Or are there any difficulties with that?
I mean, the first question is, can you still use the building that the way it is built, right? And can you change it or upgrade it in some way to still use it, in my opinion? I mean, there are some initiatives also that say you should not tear down any more buildings because that's the most environmentally friendly thing and uses less CO2 emissions. So I think that's the first thing to look at. And I mean, the goal would be to build new buildings in a way that they can be actually changed more easily, like the layout can be changed, or they can be changed from being an apartment building to being a school or whatever, an office building. Or I mean, we see now offices, for example, are not needed as much anymore, but we cannot tear down all office buildings. So I wasn't meaning that the buildings from 1975 need to be torn down and recycled. They need to be still used, but maybe upgraded and changed and improved and renovated.
Maybe I will just add that from the work we are doing, one of the things we are working, especially with developing countries, is to develop a characterization of building materials that can be reused or recycled in some form, but then also on building codes that enable examination of structural integrity of buildings that can be retained and remodified and retrofitted with the levels of efficiency that are required. So it's a little bit of both. But in our experience in the countries we are working in, many of the countries are not sure which materials can be reused, recycled, the technologies that allow them to reuse that. And so that is something we are beginning to work on. Can we find a characterization of what those materials are? It's also a little bit context specific, because some materials, concrete and steel, are universal, but there are also materials that are specific to certain locations. And so in undertaking that characterization of materials that are reusable, some aren't, they are deleterious and countries should be getting, rid of them or not using them. There are countries that still have asbestos, for example. But generally, I think that characterization of materials and what is reusable would be useful for many of the developing countries in building, and implementing their building codes, but also enabling, especially, I think it's Christina who was saying, the SMEs and the medium, small companies that really work in this industry and are active at national level to work better in terms of complying with the building codes.
Yeah, thanks, Rose. I kind of almost have a follow-up question to that. I know Senta said it in her presentation. Christina, I think, Rose, you touched upon it as well, and some of our previous speakers in other webinars as well. That's the lack of data in the building sector. So we're aware that the building sector is emitting significant amounts, but somehow if you really want to trickle down to targeted policy actions, we always approach the problem of lack of data. Is there something or some recommendations you can give to how can we overcome this problem? Like if I'm a policy advisor first or a policy maker, where can I start to alleviate the problem of absence of data? Is it capacity building that we need to start? Should we make policymakers more aware? Do we need to target the industry more? Is it really regulations that they need to collect specific data? How can we start there? Senta, I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I mean, I said it already. I think that, I mean, at least for Europe, obviously it's not the case for all countries, but we have the energy performance certificates, which can be expanded to include like material passports, where we see what material is actually has been built into this building. And of course, if the building is already older, that is more difficult. But still, it's possible, and there are projects that deal with looking at having material data banks to see what kind of materials are in buildings and how can they be recycled, reused, can they be recycled? Obviously, things like asbestos cannot definitely not be used again, and probably also not be recycled in any way. But most of the materials can be, maybe not for buildings, but then for another usage. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that building construction materials need to be reused in new buildings. So I think a lot is already being done, and there are a lot of possibilities for gathering data. I mean, some countries like Denmark already gather a lot of data on buildings automatically through the performance certificates. Other countries like Germany have strict rules of not gathering any data on anything. So because people are afraid to give their data, even if it's on the building. So I think there needs to be more done from the European side, but I think that this can be a good possibility for gathering the necessary data that we need. Because when we're looking at buildings, I mean, we can't forget, we're always looking at an individual building. I mean, most buildings are not being built according to some scheme. So it is very important to look at the individual buildings also.
Jan.
Yes, I would put forward the bold hypothesis that if you put a price on carbon, then you actually get better data. I believe that the EU ETS sector in the European Union has got one of the best monitoring, reporting, and verification processes, and probably the best transparency of emissions for a specific sector. I'm not saying that this is the silver bullet which gets it all, but that can definitely help. In Germany, of course, since the beginning of the year, there is now a price on carbon for emissions from the heating sector and transport sector as well. So kind of the two main sectors outside of the EU ETS. There's the hope that this will kind of increase and or or further the data transparency and the data awareness in this area. And of course, the Fit for 55 package is kind of now suggesting, the European Commission is suggesting to have a similar training scheme in heat and transport as it does for the other electricity and industry sectors. So maybe some improvement will be kind of happening in those areas due to this policy improvement. Thank you.
Rose, I see you've raised your hand.
Obviously, from a different perspective, because our mandate is to support developing countries, what we found with data is that it's very important for us to work with these countries to establish data systems, one, to support decision making for the policymakers, but also implementation. So whether it's for standards or regulations that they have, they need a substantial amount of data to be able to do that. But this data also enables them to develop the decision support tools that they use on a day-to-day basis in the different ministries. We talk about buildings, but the codes range anywhere from health to energy to a whole range of other areas. And so having a system that allows them to have an integrated approach to that data so that there's a seamless transfer of that information and data to enable decision making is very important. It's almost basic, but this is really some of the work we do to support them. And so one of the things we are now doing increasingly is just working with countries on developing digital platforms using the available digital technologies on how they can collect this data, but also how they can share it seamlessly across the different government sectors and ministries to precisely do what I said before, to enable the decisions that need to be done, but also the tools that need to be developed to support decision making. And some of that data, so whether it is to help them to categorize materials for building, including those which can be recyclable and reused, so material passports as they'll be called in Europe, or looking at options for carbon tax depending on the levels of urban emissions. All this requires systems and platforms that a lot of these countries don't have. But what we've seen with the modern technologies, especially the digital technologies, it's quite actually easy and not as prohibitively costly as it would have been in the past to set up. And so it really enables the country to transform their building industry quite substantially by just providing that support.
Thank you for this very comprehensive answer. And also looking at the time, I see we are about to finish. I want to thank all our distinguished speakers. It was such a pleasure to have this conversation with you today. And I also want to thank all our participants that joined. And I leave the closing remarks to Jan.
Yes, thank you very much. I just wanted to say that this has been a fascinating discussion on an absolute pivotal topic. I believe a topic which will keep us busy for not just until the end of the year with the COP, but for many years and decades to come. So the expertise which we've seen here from Senta, Rose, Christina, and Will, I think will be absolutely critical over the coming decades. And we thank them for sharing some of the expertise with us here today. We, of course, wish the UK government all the success for the COP26. And we here in Germany also believe that this is an absolute critical moment. The international kind of attitude towards climate change mitigation and adaptation has changed dramatically, not just in the US, but also in other governments. And we believe that there's now some positive momentum, which we very much hope that will be kind of crystallized and fully in the year COP26 in Glasgow at the end of the year. Of course, Germany is also preparing for the COP. In Paris, countries agreed to a regular tightening of their own measures. The so-called ratchet mechanism means that more and more ambitious targets are being formulated every 5 years on a basis of technological, economic, and social progress. And we've heard some of this technological, economic, and social progress in a specific area today. And that's why we believe that there's a chance to kind of tighten up these targets, which we have increasingly. And you might have heard already from a couple of side sentences in the discussions today that in Germany, we're not just talking about net zero in 2050 any longer, but due to a court case, which has been brought to the Constitutional Court a couple of months ago, the German government has now decided to go for a net zero target in 2045, which kind of psychologically, at least for me, feels much closer than 2050. I don't know what it is, but kind of it's 20 in a couple of years now. That kind of everything of what we're talking about, all of the energy system will have to be net zero on emissions by then. And that's why we believe that, yes, there has to be activities in not just the carbon pricing side, but the regulation side, and of course the kind of research and development side as well, to push forward these new technologies and these new ways of dealing with our economic system further and further too. And it basically all has to fit together, in my view. There's not that single policy which will deliver it all, as I mentioned at the beginning. And we believe that the Fit for 55 package, which the European Commission has put forward last week, is actually a very good step or an example of this holistic approach. So I just want to close by thanking the organizations, the excellent chairmanship as well. Congratulations. Obviously, digital conferences can work with great chairmanship. And I want to thank all the speakers, not just at this webinar, but also at the previous webinar series. It was a pleasure hearing from various international experts over the course of 3 weeks about ongoing activities and commitments from the research industry, policymakers, and startups. And as we all know, the time to act is now, and only concerted efforts will allow us to tackle climate change successfully. And I think this has been kind of in a microcosm a perfect example. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.